what I want to talk about here is some of the things I've been working on in just the last year that I actually, frankly, don't understand very well, some of the results I'm getting, and so I really enjoy some input about what this means, whether you think it's valuable, and so forth. So the talk's going to try to blow through some foundational stuff so that I can spend most of the time on the newer stuff. Okay, so a lot of people around here at the Gunn Institute engage in mapping ecosystem services, and so I probably don't have to convince you how useful that is, right? Understanding where ecosystem services come from, where they flow, who benefits, what all that's worth, is interesting scientifically, but also really policy relevant, as many of us are engaged in finding out. So here are a lot of examples from the published literature, lots and lots of unpublished work as well within agencies to try to find out the sources of ecosystem services and their benefits to people spatially. One thing that I think the literature is pretty weak on, though, is investigations into how these services will change over time in scenarios. So a static snapshot of today's distribution of benefits isn't as interesting as how will they change under its decision scenario or under a climate change scenario and things like that. So that's one reason to focus not on these static maps, as has been the topic of many of the papers here, but also on the change that we can expect. So it's informative of decisions. It's also economically more meaningful. You're on much more solid ground economically to think about changes, especially marginal ones, than total value. So I'm not the first one to say that, and in fact lots of people are also working on change of ecosystem services. That typically has to do with scenarios, though. People posit discrete alternative scenarios of the future and then value a set of ecosystem services under those different scenarios. So here's a set from Steve Pulaski at Minnesota, a conservation scenario, forestry expansion, and then showing change in aggregate benefits. Here's another one from Eric Nelson of scenario 1 and 2. This is a development scenario and then a conservation one to contrast it. So kind of chunky alternative futures scenarios. And that's been a good choice because you can make those futures policy relevant, so let's decide about one decision or another. It's also simplifies things just to get things down to simple, discrete futures, and you can engage stakeholders in designing those future scenarios. Again, it's been kind of the bread and butter, more recently, of ecosystem service mapping work. What I want to talk about is another way of thinking about change, and I think one that's more powerful in some ways than those scenarios approaches, and that's to actually try to map marginal values of ecosystem services. That is the value of the next unit of change across all possible next units of change. So not chunky scenario A versus scenario B, but a map of actual marginal change. So that again has better grounding in economic theory and typical practice to value small marginal changes. You're on sort of safer theoretical ground and empirical ground that way economically. But also a lot of decisions are in fact marginal. A given landowner is making a decision about a given parcel, not a broad suite of policies across the state of Minnesota, right? So not only is it, again, a little firmer economically, but it's also policy relevant in a lot of ways. So here's what I mean by that. So again, it's the value of the next unit of change. And again, these crossing curves, you know, every single economics class and textbook are all about marginal costs and benefits. So economists are used to valuing things in the margin. So imagine a fake watershed with a system of rivers, and imagine a forest cover that provides sediment retention, so it keeps sediment out of the streams. So if we deforest this little square of forest, there'll be some effect on the change in sediment. But if we deforest the same area somewhere else, that change will probably be much different. And if we deforest the same amount somewhere else, that change will probably be different. So I'd posit that this unit change will probably have a bigger impact on the change in sediment than that one would have, right? Lots of abundant forest, pretty far from the source of the beneficiaries, whereas this is the only game in town very close to who needs sediment retention services, right? So there's lots of reasons to think that marginal values would vary a lot over space. I said that already. Okay, so that's kind of the conceptual foundation. I want to think about how to map marginal values of ecosystem service, because I don't think people have done it. They've either mapped current values or big chunky changes under scenarios, and I think these continuous maps of change would be useful. So, as I often do, I'm going to look at crop pollination as my ecosystem service as choice. Many of you have seen this slide already before, even though I've been here a short amount of time, but crop pollination gives us lots of good food, right? So all of these things require animal pollinators to move pollen from one individual to another to set the full marketable fruit that farmers need. So blueberries are important here, watermelons are important here, tomatoes, this is a bumblebee on tomatoes, this is a honeybee on coffee. This is my favorite twofer, both cacao and almonds, obligate outcross plants. You get none of either without bees. So, well, insect pollinator vectors, and of course coffee, which is important to my life. So, honeybees are declining. We're pretty worried about that from a colony collapse disorder kind of story point of view. So it has a lot of people wondering about the value of wild pollinators. So wild pollinators that are just there in the agricultural landscapes, can they step in and provide substitutes for these managed honeybees if they decline? And if so, have we kept enough habitat around in agricultural landscapes to let them do that? So that's kind of the basic frame there. I've worked on that in a field experiment way. So here's a big farm in Costa Rica in yellow, forest patches in green. And I found that near forest patches, there was a lot more visits from native bees than in a medium distance class or a far distance class, essentially the near blue dots versus the farther ones. And this same kind of result, this is visitation rate, but deposition of pollen onto flowers declined in the same way. The yield of coffee declined in the same way. And I did all these controlled experiments to show that that decline in yield was due to pollination and nothing else. So I'm not going to show you all that. That's what got me into this work in the first place. And it's going to provide some of the data for what I'm going to do next. So I did that about 10 years ago as a postdoc. And since then, there have been about 25 studies of the same basic design all over the world. Essentially every continent, 16 different crops, all kinds of different bee faunas. And the authors of all those studies got together more recently and tried to synthesize what we've all been learning in our individual little field plots. So this is essentially a plot, just like the one I showed you, of visitation rate against distance from forest for all these different papers. Here's mine. So this is like a continuously modeled version of what I showed you with bargrass. And here's the same thing all over the place from different people. Right? And so what we found is that actually there's a lot of generality. That actually the visitation rate of native bees drops really steeply, and like this we estimate, with distance from forest. And that gray zone is the zone of uncertainty. Right? So across all these different studies, all these different crops, all these different continents, all these different bee faunas, this and several other really general patterns came out. So we seem to think that there's some general stuff going on. The easiest way to think about this decline, which again is like the synthesis, it's the best agreement overall decline taken from all these studies. So super fancy hierarchical Bayesian modeling to get from all of these different studies into one overall response. Again, I'm going through this fast because I want to get to the recent stuff. But the way to think about this, maybe most simply, is that at what point, at what distance, does visitation fall in half? Right? That might be a relevant little handle. And that turns out to be about 700 meters from forest. So on average, across all these studies, the consensus of all those studies seems to be that there's a pretty steep and pretty constrained, pretty certain decline in visitation rate and other things, and that it's steep enough to fall in half when you get 3/4 of a kilometer away from forest. Okay, so that's just a rush through some of the stuff that got me here. Field experience showing that ecosystem services of pollination matter and proximity to forest matters. Synthesis with a bunch of other people showing that it seems to be kind of a general thing. And that emboldened us to actually try to build a model. So let's test how general we can be about how we understand ecosystem service benefits distributed across landscapes by trying to write it down very simply in a model. But here's the intuition of the model, right? So here's an agricultural landscape, and forest is in green, and let's say a coffee field is in yellow. And this is all kinds of different farms of different kinds. And what we let the model do is take data on the relative source abundance of bees. And then we let those bees fly around the landscape. We simulate their flights around the landscape, and we use what we found in general from those synthesis papers to dictate how far they go and when they stop. Right? So this dictates how much of abundance from this patch kind of smears out with distance and tapers off. And then we model the effect of all those bees that are arriving on this field on the yield of that field. And we have data from the coffee study to draw this curve. They usually look like this, right? A few bees get you a lot more yield, and then it returns to diminish and asymptotes there. So there's some yield function, and we estimated ours. And then we take that added yield, so maybe bees improved yield here by 10%, and then we kind of distribute it back out to the forests where the bees came from, so that we can accumulate a value of those forests as the sources of this benefit, right? And we do that for all possible fields, and these things accumulate value, and we get a map of value. So we do all that with very simple production functions, simple enough that we can use data from almost anywhere. We don't need even the data I had to get in Costa Rica. And so people can actually use this where they haven't sent a postdoc for 3 years like someone sent me, right? And then for those of you who know this kind of jargon, this is the basis of the INVEST model for pollination. So INVEST is this toolkit of ecosystem service models, and this is the math and the intuition behind the pollination one. And all the different models of INVEST have a similar kind of story. A group of people trying to write down a general model and then put it all together. I just want to kind of convince you that this model works in Costa Rica before I start using it to do this marginal stuff. So here's the broader landscape of that same field study I did. Here's this big coffee field, now at brown, and here are my 12 field sites. There were 15 others, but I'll just show you 12. So that's the landscape and a very simple classification of that landscape. And then we use the model to predict that abundance, right? So we did source abundance, we let bees fly around in the model, and we toted up how many bees we predicted would land at every farmed pixel in the landscape. And we compared that to how many bees I found in my 12 sites, say. So here's a map. The forest is in green stipple for reference, and then the shades of black indicate relative bee abundance. So the darker black, the more the model predicts abundance. So you can see bees are predicted to be abundant near the edges of forest and less so in the middle. And these are the sites I went out to go measure that kind of thing. And yeah, it's a nice fit between predicted and observed on-farm abundance. So it seems like the model's reproducing my data. And I didn't go into this, but we parameterized the model blind to my data. It's built to run without having been there to collect field data. And so we pretended we didn't know what my data said and parameterized it as if we'd never been there. So these are truly independent validation tests. Okay, and then we can have the model predict the distribution of current value. So here's average value spatially. This is where the pollination services are coming from in the landscape. So says the model. And here's the prediction, again, against the pollen limitation I found in the field. That's a measure of how much bees are helping yields in the coffee farms. And again, a pretty good fit for ecology, showing that what the model's predicting is borne out by my independent data set, right? Okay. So now, we've written all that up and published all that stuff, but now I want to get to these marginal value questions that I've begun to think about recently. So I'd like to know, just like I set up with that cartoon example with watersheds, where would deforestation in this landscape I've just showed you result in the largest losses of ecosystem services? Where would forest loss hurt the most? And to whom would that hurt? So which users of ecosystem services are most vulnerable to likely deforestation? So across all possible marginal changes, who are the farmers that are most vulnerable to deforestation and vulnerable to losing yields because of lost pollination services? And then thinking more hopefully, where would forest restoration most enhance ecosystem services? Exactly the converse. Where could we regrow forest that would have the best marginal impact on coffee production in the landscape? Right? These clear? Okay. So here's question one, and this is what we've been producing recently. So again, where would forest loss result in the largest change in service? So what we do is we just go on the landscape and take a block of land, a group of pixels, and deforest all the forest in that block. So anything that was forest within that square is now pasture. We just assumed it would go to pasture because that's terrible for bees. And then we reran the model on the whole landscape and asked, how much less coffee can that landscape produce? And that is the marginal loss production for the forest in there. And so we attributed that loss to the forest inside that pixel, right? So that's, if that forest went away, that's how much value in coffee production would go away. So that's the marginal value of the forest in there. And then we regrow it, move to the next one, and do it again. Right? So it's systematically asking, where are the most important pixels? Where would the losses change the most? Right? So we just go around and around and around. And this green map is the answer. So this is the result we get. So you can see the dark greens are the places where marginal values are actually quite high in dollars per hectare per year, and the paler greens less high. And I know this landscape really well. You guys probably don't remember it, but where the dark greens tend to be are where there are lots of coffee nearby and not a lot of forest nearby. And so, you know, from staring at this, I think areas of high marginal value are predicted by where there's good bee habitat, so where there's forest that bees like, where there's lots of coffee nearby. Remember, this is a big coffee area. And this is the crucial thing about marginal, where there are few substitutes, meaning if you lose that patch of forest, there isn't another patch nearby to keep producing bees that go to the same coffee, right? So that's substitutes or saturation of these concepts in economics. So you can see that, you know, this peninsula of forest that was surrounded by coffee has really high marginal value because if it gets cut, there's no substitute to fill in. Whereas the leading edges of, say, this patch are paler green, because if you lose that leading edge, there's a big patch of forest that is close enough to all the coffee this was close to step in and be a substitute, right? So marginal values happen when substitutes are few, okay? Here's another way to look at that, same map again. Here's just a plot of marginal value of forest patches against the percent of forest within 500 meters, say, of that pixel. So we've done this map, and now we're just analyzing all the pixels on that map against how alone it is as a forest, right? So, and you can see that when there's lots of forest nearby, marginal values are really low. If you lose that one pixel, not a huge difference overall because there's lots of substitutes nearby. But as your surrounding amount of forest goes down, the marginal value goes way up exponentially, right? So the interesting thing is, over time, as deforestation continues, you'd expect pixels to start moving left on that landscape, right? As forest goes away, there'll be more and more with fewer pixels nearby. So you'd imagine that the average marginal value of a given pixel of forest would go up, right? As substitutes go away, those patches that remain become more and more valuable in a marginal sense. So one obvious thing to do is just say, okay, so we've done this fancy marginal value approach. Does it provide different information than the old average value approach, the one that was just about the current snapshot of value? So here's a plot of average value, like the current snapshot of value, against marginal value for all the pixels in my landscape. And we plotted this just to see whether this changes your answer, right? And I think three things about this graph. And again, I haven't been thinking about it very long. One is there is a broad correlation, right? So it's not like a complete gunshot blast. It tends to be true that static values go up as marginal values do. But the two other things are interesting among that. One is this line here is the regression line. Okay, so that's predicting marginal given average. If you only knew average, how good a prediction could you make of this marginal value? And the interesting thing is how many positive, huge outliers there are over this line. So for the most part, lots of dots sit on the line. Very few are way, way below the line, such that you're way overestimating marginal with average. But there's a bunch that are way underestimated by average value, right? So you're missing some of the places that are absolutely critical to providing pollination services if you just think about snapshot values. So the darkest green in the marginal values aren't predictable from the old way of doing things. Okay? And then the other point is the one-to-one line. So this is just you know, the slope of one line. That vast majority of the points are below it. And there's gazillions of points in here, so that adds to that, but only a few are above this line. Almost all are below, which means on average, you are overestimating value when you do snapshot average values, right? So you'll overstate the value of the average pixel, except for these bigger outliers, when you calculate values the old way. Okay? So question 2, right? So that was marginal value, aggregate. Now let's track each farm pixel individually. So not just the whole change of value for the landscape, but let's ask, pixel by pixel, farmer by farmer, who's losing for every change of forest. So same thing. Go through deforest block after block after block, but this time track the change of every pixel independently. So now we have a map of the change of value pixel by pixel. Who on a landscape is suffering from deforestation? And there's lots of ways to depict that after you do that gazillion times thing. All I've done is the maximum % loss. So shades of red now are the maximum of all possible changes in forest. What's the maximum loss that this guy here suffered? And what's the maximum loss that this farmer here suffered and this farmer here suffered? So you can do mean and median and frequency of loss or whatever, but this is just of the most painful deforestation event, how big was it? And same kind of thing, there's a spatial distribution. Some are really vulnerable. They could lose relatively more than others. And some are less vulnerable, meaning their production doesn't depend on nearby forest right now, so changing forest won't have a big marginal impact on them. And again, staring at this, I think the risk is kind of the converse of the marginal value in that. High risk is when you're near forest, but not too near, right? If you're so close to lots of forest, the loss of any one piece doesn't hurt you much. And again, you have few substitutes. So essentially, high risk is being near high marginal value. So wherever the forest was dark green in the last map, nearby farmers are dark red. So I like this because for a couple of reasons. It really emphasizes that ecosystem services are a function of both the supply and the characteristics of the users of that. If that user's got plenty, then each unit of supply isn't so valuable. And it also lets us track individual beneficiaries. And I think ecosystem services science has lumped all beneficiaries way too much. So parsing them out to see who's winning and who's losing under change is a nice way to go, and this is a first step towards that for at least us. All right, so a third question, where would restoration most enhance pollination services? Same thing in reverse, right? So go through every square. If it's not forest, make it forest, and ask how much more coffee gets produced in the landscape. So, and again, it's the converse. So you can imagine in forest deserts, restoration value is really high. In places where there's lots of forest around, you don't get much marginal bump out of the next piece of forest. So not all that shocking, but putting numbers on the spatial variance of restoration value. And again, the take-home thing is high restoration values where there's lots of coffee nearby, but it's far from existing sources of use. Yeah?
Is this at all accounting for where you put the forest in the desert of forest?
Yeah, it's exactly doing that. So the color of every grid cell is the value of putting forest on that grid cell.
Okay.
Yeah?
If you start with a completely blank map, what shape does the computer say is the best? Because I would think that you might actually end up with like a honeycomb or something that's going to maximize perimeter. It's going to say regrow forest into this basically shape to minimize distance to any parcel on the aggregate.
Yeah, that's exactly what it'll do. It's a really good question, and I agree. So, in other words, what's the optimal landscape to deliver crop pollination services here? And I would probably say that it's a regular grid of patches that are 20 hectares big, separated by 2 kilometers in every direction, because that steepness happens at about 1 kilometer. So, you know, not the best outcome for biodiversity.
But they would theoretically all be linked, right? It would be just basically just a complete patchwork, almost like a honeycomb, if you were looking at it.
It wouldn't have to be linked, though. Bees just need a certain size, no corridors per se. So they could just be like dots on like a regular gridded dot map. And so, and which is interesting because that, you know, that's a little disturbing. You don't really want to argue too hard for pollination services if that's the result. And it, I mean, it gets kind of philosophical, but I think if you take any ecosystem service alone and you run it out to its kind of logical extreme, you get a really perverse result. It's true in pollination. Carbon storage, you know, if you want to only maximize carbon storage, you would grow eucalypts, cut them down in 30 years, grow them again. Cut them down, grow them again, sink them in the ocean or something. So, you know, any single service gets a little perverse, and we get in trouble for that in like public fora and things, but I want to say one more thing. I think the more we stack and bundle services, the safer we are from that, because it's really hard to get a perverse outcome when you're trying to get carbon and pollination and a water supply and recreation. It's hard to beat natural forest after a while when you have several going. Yeah?
Can we go back to question 2?
Yep.
You said it, but I didn't get it. What are you varying in order to generate that? Are you generating parcel by parcel or lots of parcels?
Parcel by parcel.
Okay, so that's the,
Yeah.
so the red is the sort of summed impact of parcel by parcel changes over the entire forest, let's say.
Yep. I deforest, I call it a parcel because it's a group of pixels. Deforest it, ask for every agricultural pixel what the percent change in their production was. Then I reforest it and go to the next one and ask for every agricultural pixel what their change was. So I have, no, I took the maximum percent loss.
Okay.
This is a map of the max.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Sum's okay, mean's okay, median's okay. Number of times that exceeds this amount of loss might be a good way to do it.
Well, some is probably not okay.
Right.
That's why I asked.
Yeah. Why is some not okay?
Because of the saturation. Right? If you add the impact of doing each one in place, while the others are constant, when you're done, you've actually summed up the effect of removing the forest.
Yep. That means mean's not okay too. Well, okay, you're right. The absolute number is not meaningful.
Yeah,
But the spatial pattern would be the same as the median, right? Because every pixel is that sum. If we do the mean, every pixel is that sum divided by the number of changes, which is constant.
except that the method has this saturation function, which isn't going to get dealt with
Yep.
by that method. It's adding things up in a linear way, but there's
Well, it's
an underlying
not
nonlinearity.
Yeah, that's true.
Are you factoring in the market value of land in here? In other words, are the farmers along the margins actually paying for that service in that the land is valued higher because it's more productive? And
Yeah.
if so, then it's a totally different analysis.
It is, and that's also going to, you keep and what I haven't done.
I've peeked at your slides ahead of time.
But
So-
Austin, I mean, following on that trend too, I would think that some of those areas near the edges may have other factors that will make their value go down. For example, they might be farther from roads, they might have more problems, maybe not in a coffee crop, but certainly in like soybean or maize or something like that.
You know how an
with
economist
animals.
deals with that? They say ceteris paribus, all else equal.
Which is never saying.
But I mean, if you wanted to,
Yeah.
surely.
So I found, again, with all the field data, I have yields for a lot of these different farms within this big patch of forest and this big patch of coffee, and I didn't find any evidence that land values were higher in your forest, and I didn't find any evidence independent of pollination that crop yields varied with distance. Right, so you'd imagine that for a lot of reasons, since usually deforestation kind of happens and then grows. You'd imagine the middle of the farm might be farmed longer than the edges, so the soils might be tired. Lots of things can change with distance from forest, microclimate and things, but I didn't find any non-pollination effects.
So on the number 3,
Yeah.
I was just wondering how much you felt the kind of marginal value of restoration captures components of the sort of the economic production functions under which the coffee farmers are working. I think it'd be really interesting to see if there are relationships between inputs and labor, variation in inputs and labor based on how much they're getting, how much the flow of pollination services to their land, and that type of map I think would be like an eye popper for a farmer
Yeah.
to see, yeah, where it is they're having to exert themselves and where they don't.
Right. So net of variable costs.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you mean? Did I say that right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah. You could put it all in terms of cost, I suppose.
Okay. So yeah. So because let me just see if I understand this. So if they're producing more coffee, they're having to pick more. They might demand more fertilizer since there's more production coming out of the plant.
I was also thinking in terms of if there's any substitution between pollination services and inputs, like if they're trying to sort of standardize yields like across their land, and yet some need a lot more input or labor than others.
Yeah.
That could be a really interesting kind of. And I think the way you frame this is it would be an interesting extension.
Yeah.
Or the farmer might be more interested in marginal changes in yield, so maybe it's more effective to put the fertilizer near the edges where you're also getting the pollination services.
Yeah. Yeah.
Californians rent bees.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is probably cheaper than giving up land to have native ones nearby. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna review these take homes. So really the kind of 4 main points I wanted to make is that this marginal approach can help identify consequences of change, and that's not only economically firmer ground, but also more policy relevant for some of the marginal changes that happen under typical decisions. And taking that approach can identify areas where forest loss is most costly, where farmers might be most at risk, and where restoration is most valuable. So again, in contrast to these sort of chunky scenario questions, asking the continuous optimization question is where is the most, where is the least. And I talked about pollination, but it occurs to me that it's applicable to lots of ecosystem services. And again, I think about all these static average maps that we've been producing, and I begin to wonder what we actually mean by them. And it's not just pollination. I think it's most important for ecosystem services with spatial dynamics, because that's where the substitution can matter, right? And I guess I already said this, but decisions are typically at this marginal scale, and it unlocks all kinds of optimization problems that conservation biologists love to think about, right? So if you think about the conservation planning literature and Mark Sand and things, it's all about that, choosing, maximizing marginal gain per step. So this puts ecosystem services into that same kind of framework. Okay, here's the thing that Austin already talked about almost entirely, and Chris a little bit. So there's lots of improvements to this. I'd love to hear what you guys think, but here's what's on my mind. One is, I think to truly think about this optimization, you need to compare with costs. So just on the benefit side, there's opportunity costs of restoring this forest, the benefit side of growing more coffee if you deforest and so forth. So just showing the benefit side isn't going to be all that informative policy, but the marginal approach is what we were after. And then other services to get at these trade-offs. So it's not just about coffee pollination. This is only from Costa Rica, but we have 2 grants now to test this model, and in particular this kind of marginal restoration approach elsewhere. And then this is what Austin scooped really, is the minimum patch size is a big glaring thing, and we fit it really sloppily in this example, so we could fit the model much better. Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure I said. Other questions?
Why is the forest more hospitable to the bees than the coffee plants themselves?
It's a great question. It has to do with the biology of the bees that come to coffee, which are these stingless bees, these meliponine bees, and those are social bees. And they're active year-round, so they make nests in tree cavities, and they require year-round forage. And neither of those are in abundance in coffee, because coffee's, in here at least, a very highly managed young place without a lot of cavities for these meliponines, and it flush flowers over 3 months and then is silent in a flowering sense the rest of the year. So both because there's a diversity of flowering to keep bees in food all year round, and because there's lots of cavities in mature forests, they tend to like this. It's a good question though, because one of the things I'm doing since I got here is trying to start up broadly similar work in Vermont, and the story is very different in Vermont. Bees aren't in forests here. They're ground nesters. They like open habitats. You could argue that a farm road is better habitat than a forest for bees in Vermont. So I've been struggling to figure out what the equivalent questions are here, and trying to be careful not to just imprint my Costa Rican perspective on Vermont, trying to make it for like Costa Rica up here. So it didn't have to be what I just said for Costa Rica, it just happens to be that in Costa Rica they need forest. So I am trying to think about what to do next with this stuff, and one is I've been going out in the field this spring and summer in Vermont, just seeing what bees come where. So you may know these blueberry farms, Adams, Norris, Alishead, Pelkey's. Anna Bushamin and I have been going out over the spring and summer just sampling bees on blueberries and other crops. So far, Alishead's the winner. You can congratulate them if you know them in Alishead. Many more native species of bees than Adams, which is kind of interesting, right? Like a famous organic grower, but also close into town. So these were really preliminary data, and we're going to write proposals this year with a little more knowledge about actually asking a question here. So we've been out there sampling honeybees or bees on crops, and then yeah, that's it. Thanks.